I made it my mission to show the larger Elder Scrolls community why Daggerfall is worth playing despite its age. But what about those who simply cannot get into it even after trying? There will always be gamers who are used to a certain style of game and struggle to go backwards. It's why some Morrowboomers can get a bad rap for how preachy they can be towards fans who have only played Skyrim. And not wanting to sound like them with Daggerfall, I will say that I understand that for some, older games just aren't for them. What can these people do then? Well, a modder known as Oricus Zero has come up with a solution. Skygerfall is the result, a mod that valiantly attempts to recreate the main quest of Daggerfall within the creation engine. This was possible through the hard work of Oricus Zero combined with a huge compilation of mods created by the Skyrim modding community, even utilizing models from the Witcher series, with permission from CD Projekt Red of course. Ports of older Elder Scrolls titles into newer engines aren't something new, but Skygerfall does have the accolade of being the first publicly downloadable one to successfully recreate an older Elder Scrolls game in Skyrim, although it had to make a lot of sacrifices to make that possible. So the question is, from a Daggerfall fan, is Skygerfall a decent enough replacement for those who cannot play Daggerfall even with all of its enhancements? This is what we will be finding out in this video. To start, I downloaded every recommended mod mentioned by the author in the description and requirements section. So there will be some sections where I criticize mods that Oricus Zero didn't add into the main file themselves, such as Simply Climb or Dagger Dungeons. With everything downloaded, let's hit New Game and start our adventure. We immediately start in the Character Creator. Being Skyrim, we can play as both Imperials and Orcs. While removing them would have been more authentic, it only helps the consistency of the series to keep them included here. The racial bonuses from Daggerfall have also been included into this mod, although the UI doesn't make that clear. That means that High Elves remain the best race to pick if you're worried about paralysis later in the game. And yeah, paralysis effects are here too. While High Elf would be the smartest choice, I can't ignore the possibility to play as an Orc, with the sole goal of helping my king, Gothway, to attain the sovereignty over our homeland. And so, Gruge sets out on his adventure. The lack of a capital letter is to show Gruge's illiteracy, and has nothing to do with me forgetting to hold down the shift key. Here we have a slight departure from Skyrim, where we can pick what kind of class we intend to play. This basically selects your standing stone buff. I went with Jack of all trades, as Gruge is going to be a spell sword to take full advantage of Skyrim's lack of dice roll systems. We find ourselves in a small room faced with Emperor Uriel Septim VII and his High Chancellor Okato.
Perhaps you can find the answer and close the marble jaws of oblivion.
Okay, cool. We have some new voice acting. Extracting the voice from the old cutscene would have been hard, and by introducing voice acting, we can now have fully voiced characters later in the game. Honestly, this inclusion is a big plus, even for myself. It always feels odd in Oblivion and Skyrim when you have a silent NPC through a mod. Obviously, this speech system was made with voice acting in mind, which makes it awkward when there isn't any, so I'm happy with this change. My only gripe, which isn't limited to just this mod, is the changes in quality you will come across, not just in sound equipment and recording environments, but in acting. For the most part, each character is acted fairly well, with some nice performances from some of the cast.
She has locked herself in her castle in the Hrothgarian mountains, and experiments in magical studies with no regard for her own safety.
But others are less so.
All are free to petition His Highness at this time.
The Emperor here, for example, is decent enough, but it's a shame that there hasn't been any attempt to match the inflection of either John Gilbert's Uriel nor Patrick Stewart's take on the character, instead leaving us with a voice that we will come across again with a few of the characters. But this is the Elder Scrolls, so that's nothing new, I guess. Still, having voice acting in this mod was a great decision. We wake up in Privateer's Hold. We're told what happened through a pop-up just like in Daggerfall, and are ready to venture forth. As mentioned earlier, I am using some mods that were recommended by the author, one of them being Spec Weedle's Daggerfall Traits for Skyrim. This adds the advantages and disadvantages system from Daggerfall's character creator. By default, it works by allowing you to have a maximum of 10 pros or cons, but they must be balanced, meaning that if you choose 5 benefits, you must also choose 5 drawbacks. This isn't as balanced as the leveling buff or debuff that you would get in Daggerfall, but it does a good enough job of making sure you don't become helplessly overpowered. I chose some simple options, blocking Grood from some material types in exchange for immunity to magic and some extra levels in one-handed to help him out in the beginning, and he'll need all the help he can get because, as you will see soon, the difficulty has been altered to help Skyrim feel that bit closer to Daggerfall. We start in the familiar cave using Skyrim's assets, but soon we step into the dungeon proper and are greeted with some new texture work. Straight away, I'm not a fan. While great care has been taken to replicate the aesthetic of Daggerfall, in some of the dungeons it falls flat, which is a shame because later on the dungeon textures begin to work really well, but for whatever reason in the very first dungeon here, they just don't do it for me. Of course, trying to modernize Daggerfall's textures wouldn't have been easy, but I would have preferred to have seen some influence taken from the Dream mod, at least when it comes to Privateer's Hold here. Coming to the gameplay, and there isn't much to say. It's Skyrim and plays like Skyrim, which means that multi-class setups work really well. I played a spell sword, but any build would likely work just fine. The combat is as you would expect, except with one big change. The enemies are not scaled, or at least they weren't noticeably so. That means that these beginning encounters are particularly punishing. This is a welcome change that helps replicate that beginning difficulty many of us first faced when starting in Daggerfall. It also means that at times, running away will be your best choice until you get stronger. The entire bestiary of Daggerfall has been implemented as well, meaning you can face off against all of your favourites, such as the skeletons from hell. They are missing their scream unfortunately though. Material dependent enemies have been added too, meaning that silver weapons or better will be needed when fighting an imp for example. Speaking of weapons, a lot of the items from Daggerfall have found their way here as well. When starting a new game, you begin with an assortment of gear. Essentially every option you could have been given at the start of Daggerfall is here, as well as Geralt's armor because why not I guess. The mod has made a good attempt of importing Daggerfall's item list. We have all of the ingredients which can be looted and harvested. There is a ton of new armor and weapons such as mithril and adamantine, and even some of the useless clutter like oil and holy tomes are included. Unfortunately, some of the higher tier gear didn't seem to be here. I reached level 20 but I never came across any dwarven or daedric armor for example, only weapons. Either way, I enjoyed having access to all the new loot that wasn't originally in Skyrim. Having fought his way through Privateer's Hold, Grood stumbles across a reward chest. These are added at the end of the dungeons, and I'm glad they are. I never liked how in Daggerfall you find so little loot at times. Let's just take some of these and get on our way. It's important to remember that Orica Zero's goal was only to import Daggerfall's main quest, so that is where his efforts were placed. With that in mind, the overworld is understandably lacking. It does a decent job of replicating Daggerfall's game world, even that bay just outside the starting dungeon is here. The main noticeable difference is the size. This world is tiny. Apparently the map is close to 2/3 of Skyrim, but it honestly feels much smaller than that. Likely not helped by the choice to make the land incredibly flat. The flatness makes sense from the perspective of the DOS version to be fair, but man is it a trip to see Gothway Garden clear as day just a few meters away from Privateer's Hold. This becomes especially hilarious later on when you can see Woodborne Manor and Direnni Tower within throwing distance of Wayrest, or even Sentinel's Palace from across the sea from High Rock. I chose to use the optional paper map for nostalgia's sake. Of course, Daggerfall was created with fast travel in mind, and this mod is no different, so it isn't a surprise that the world design wasn't a priority, so I don't mind these visual discrepancies too much. With the great shrinking of the map and only a focus on the story, naturally the majority of towns and other locations have been removed, leaving only the essential ones. The author could have left it there, but there have been some additions that are appreciated. Noticeably, the monument to King Lysandus at Cringane Field. This is mentioned a lot in the original, but is nowhere to be found, so it was a pleasant surprise to come across it. You'll also notice some cool landmarks that didn't have to be added, but it's great that they were, such as the lighthouse off the coast of Bethany Island, or some old ruins dotted around. Speaking of additions, the recommended Dagger Dungeons mod adds a few of the crypts from Daggerfall into Skygerfall. There is one just a small walk outside of Privateer's Hold, so being the opportunistic orc that he is, Grudge saw fit to check it out. Unfortunately, these were the most boring types of dungeons to add. Instead of creating some custom dungeons using Daggerfall tile sets, which Orica Zero does nicely in a few places, this mod instead plays it safe with these 2 of the 3 room affairs, most of which offer no enemies. The loot is okay and helps a bit when grinding for gold to kit out our character, but these were just dull. Seeing as a lot of them were broken too, I'm gonna say that this is just a case of a mod in beta that has seemingly been abandoned sadly. The test dungeon to the north of Gothway Garden shows that the author, Subtle Justice, was on the right track, with this dungeon being larger and having enemies. While Dagger Dungeons has its place for additional avenues for loot, this is not a mod that is required in my opinion. After a brief walk from that tomb, Grudge wandered into the town of Gothway Garden, following the mysterious floating arrow placed in front of his view. Yes, there are map markers. Honestly, I'm okay with them here. There isn't a whole lot to the world anyway, so the marker makes navigating the map a little easier when finding where you need to go, which will be helpful for those that don't have the locations of the key cities or dungeons baked into their mind as I do. This may be blasphemous to say, but they help so much in the dungeons that their inclusion was frankly essential for the target audience of this mod. It made navigating those labyrinths so much easier. And isn't that the point of this mod, to help streamline the game for Elder Scrolls fans who want to experience Daggerfall, but also want the comforts of Skyrim? The journal has been implemented well too. It's well written and the objectives have been laid out in a helpful way. Most people playing this mod wouldn't have played Daggerfall or read the wiki, so this does an excellent job of directing the player on not just where to go, but what they're doing. When it comes to the towns themselves, Orica Zero admits that they are just for show, with most of the buildings not leading anywhere. Aesthetics wise, it's a bit hit and miss. It's an accurate replication of medieval Britain, so props for that, but I feel it's just a little too dark for High Rock. In Daggerfall, the grass is greener and the towns are more vibrant, full of red brick and light stonework. In Skygerfall, it's all very grey, just like Skyrim itself. I'll put this down to the map using a lot of Skyrim's textures, leading to this overly grey aesthetic. In comparison then, Sentinel is a treat with its orange sand and white sandstone buildings with the bloom turned up to 100. Entering the local tavern, we are met with a modern arrangement of the classic inn music. The music of Skygerfall uses remastered versions of older tracks sourced from 4 separate artists. These are all nice updates to the originals, with most of them being entirely remade, rather than just taking the MIDI files and adding better instrumentation. They all fit very nicely and have a pretty good Jeremy Soul-like feel to them, which fits better with the creation engine in my opinion. Speaking to the innkeeper, and he gives us the letter from Brisienna that you usually get in the first few months of aimlessly wandering Daggerfall. It should be noted that Orica Zero set out to not just port the story, but also to streamline it in places, and this is an example of that. All time sections have been removed, and it just makes sense to do that in this context. There isn't much else for us to do, so directing the players straight to Gothway Garden when they exit Privateer's Hold was the way to go. While Grudge is illiterate and unable to read the letter, the omniscient floating arrow was still able to direct him to the Isle of Bethany. Setting sail, we find ourselves in a small town. Brisienna lays out our next task, and in this case using dialogue that is almost one-to-one with the original writing. For the most part, this is the case for the entire mod, while a few changes were made for streamlining purposes, or to help the player understand exactly what is going on. The mod author also mentions that his goal wasn't to make this about choice, instead having one quest lead straight into the other. So while in Daggerfall from here the player would have been free to travel to any of the 3 cities to start their investigation, Grudge has instead been pointed in the direction of Daggerfall City and talking to Queen Abakai about her mother-in-law. Daggerfall is the main hub of the game, which is the obvious choice given the game's name. Brisienna was kind enough to give us a player home for stashing loot and crafting items. And this is the only city with a store for selling and buying gear. As mentioned earlier, not everything has been included, so for Grudge the best equipment he could get was steel plate armor and a dwarven war axe. prices are reasonable enough, they are placed at a level where you will have to pay attention to looting if you want to be able to access them as early as possible. And as level scaling doesn't really exist, you will want to get your hand on the best gear you can as soon as you can. You can also craft your own items, but outside of alchemy and enchanting, this would be more work than it's worth as the supply of lower level material to grind with is limited. At least the option is here though. Travelling into the city at night, you will encounter Lysandus' undead army, who will kill you easily if given the chance, so running will be your only chance this early on. I had Daggerfall companions downloaded and met a Tenos in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, these companions were broken for me. He wouldn't follow me around and wouldn't enter dungeons with me either, so keep that in mind if you intend to use a build that relies on a companion. The city is aesthetically similar to Gothway Garden, but at least it has a city wall. The temples can be found here too. They're a bit redundant, just offering an area to craft potions and cure your diseases, but at least they have been replicated faithfully, even with the exteriors. Well, in some instances at least. Entering Daggerfall Castle, I must commend Aetherius for his work on the palace interiors. While some of the earlier dungeons may not be up to par in my opinion, these are nicely done, even adding the small side rooms and a court wizard in this instance, who you can trade with for spells. Abakai tells Grudge of her worry for her mother-in-law, and so the confused orc sets off for Shadungent, or
Shidungent.
The pronunciations are a bit inconsistent with the voice actors, which was bound to happen to be honest. It's not like my pronunciations are much better. Akulakan, Akulakan, Akalakan,
and Akulakan.
Grudge arrives in the Wrothdgarian Mountains, and it's time to stop teasing and check out those spells. With Mark and Recall, there isn't much to say. They work as intended and it's an awesome addition, effortlessly allowing you to teleport to anywhere in the world, just like in Daggerfall. Levitation on the other hand, while essential for some of the dungeons, is not as well implemented. Obviously more an issue with the engine than the mod. In Daggerfall, you can simply go up and down by pointing your cursor in that direction and walking forward, or you could use the dedicated rise and fall buttons. In Skyrim though, while your character will go up and down based on your cursor, it is a much slower method, making going up in these tight towers a bit janky. I found that jumping worked well enough, but to go down you are forced to run in circles. At least it's possible to use the spell, even if it isn't as satisfactory as it once was. Shadungent is our second dungeon then, and the first to face the axe when it comes to streamlining. Whereas the original is huge and easy to get lost in, you would have to actively try to get lost here. While the path to Nulfarga is the same as in the original, all other paths to get distracted by have been dramatically shrunk or removed entirely. Like, remember how if you went right at the beginning, you would end up exploring for 30 minutes only to find that the only way to Nulfarga was to go left? Well, there is no way to do that now. This is awesome. Sure, I said the handmade dungeons of Daggerfall were fun, and they were when compared to the randomly generated ones. They were still way too large for most people though, so Aetherius' liberal use of the streamlining here is much appreciated. I still got that claustrophobic ambiance of Daggerfall's dungeon crawling, but didn't have to use a guide once. I just followed the dungeon exploring at my heart's content, and in just 10 minutes I had found Nulfarga without even having to check the map. While some later dungeons make a better attempt at implementing that lost feeling, I kinda wish that every dungeon was as streamed as this one. As blasphemous as it may be to say that, it just fits way better with Skyrim style of gameplay. I don't think this would have worked better for Daggerfall. One thing is becoming apparent though, the default running speed here is painfully slow. Sprinting helps to alleviate it to some degree, but with Grudge's fatigue constantly running low, these dungeon hallways are feeling far longer than they did in Daggerfall. If you don't want to use Levitate within these vertical sections, for role-playing reasons for example, then Aetherius recommends the Simply Climb mod, but for whatever reason it didn't work for me, instead clipping poor Grudge into the wall and sometimes throwing him into the void. So as it is, this mod doesn't seem to work, limiting you to rely on magic. Grudge stumbles into Nulfarga's chamber. Climbing the stairs we come across Skakmat himself, the unfortunately cut dragon who bows to Nulfarga. He doesn't have much to say, but it's nice to see him here. I particularly like how he's been shrunk. he had to be to fit in this corner, but it just feels right that one of the few dragons left alive would be a runt, the last of a dying breed and a shadow of the former race of giants. Kind of like the decline of the dragons in A Song of Ice and Fire.
Eternal, eternal ruin.
Talking to Nulfarga, she is expectedly insane following her son's tragic demise. The dialogue has been rewritten here to make her more coherent, but it isn't a bad change. The voice actor's performance is nice, if not a little reserved. As I said earlier, I would have liked if the VAs were given a reference on how to act the scenes. That way we could have had a more powerful sounding Uriel or a more crazy Nulfarga. I always imagined her to sound a bit closer to the crazy cat lady from The Simpsons. But that may be more down to her design, which is also changed here. She isn't the disgruntled sorcerer here, but instead the regal Queen Mother as she may have looked back when Lysandus still reigned. Despite these changes, they don't ruin the story for me. I appreciate that it isn't made obvious that the password to the front door is shut up either, with it being mentioned in passing just like in Daggerfall, a nice touch that makes figuring out the password as rewarding as it was originally. Rouge returns to Abakai with the news, and we are rewarded for our endeavours. The rewards aren't random like in Daggerfall, which means they are actually useful at times. Rouge is taken aback when a pop-up jumps right in front of his face. If only he could read, he thinks. Then he notices that a letter has been placed in his pocket. Yep, the letter system is alive and well. Orica Zero is also aware of the limitations that this system has, with a cute meta joke later on. I critique this in my Daggerfall analysis. The letter system is a clear display of the limitations that Bethesda faced technologically in '96. So while it is still included here, it has been diminished to as infrequent as possible. The best way to integrate this would have been to use the Courier like in Skyrim proper, but it's such a small concern that it doesn't matter in the larger picture. The letter was from Morgaya. Rouge knows this because the all-knowing marker is aiming at Wayrest. A short trip later and we enter the great city of East High Rock. Of the three main hubs, Wayrest has had the biggest change. Architecturally, it is mostly identical to Daggerfall City, but unlike that city, the castle has had a severe redesign. I'm unsure why this change was made. I was looking forward to seeing a European-style estate built in the creation engine, so this was a little disappointing. At least the aesthetics have stayed intact. Even the statue maze of the original has been recreated. The interior is exactly as it should be, so there is nothing to complain about there. Even the demonic child at the entrance that creates a monster sound when activated has been added, with a more fitted name and design.
You're trying to track down that letter of the Emperor's, yes?
Morgaya directs Rouge to Scorg Barrow to deliver a message on her behalf. I noticed that Scorg Barrow is positioned incorrectly on the map. That's how petty I'm going to be. Obviously that doesn't matter, but I'm trying to be as extensive as possible here. Design-wise, I like the changes here. Not only is it a barrow now, but it sits in more with the arid geology that the Dragontail Mountains are said to have. I can't say the same for the interior though. I will preface by saying that Scorg Barrow is by far my favourite story dungeon, and it has been brutalised here. Shrunk to just the main path to Manny Marco and one decoy consisting of 2 rooms. As we found in Shadungeon, streamlining has taken priority, and Orica Zero did try to keep the main paths true to the UESP guide, except for one infamous example later on. And fair enough, the main path to Manny Marco is one of the shortest in the game, so the cuts make sense, but I'll still miss those great chasms. Regardless, I agree that this smaller dungeon works better for Skyrim and the average fan who can't go back to Daggerfall, so it is what it is. The later dungeons do make up for it by being more intact anyway. Entering Manny Marco's chamber, and hell yeah, they did my boy right.
Why do you disturb me?
No weakling Oblivion High Elf, but the Lich King in all his glory. His voice is great too. While I would have been happy with something similar to Elder Scrolls Online, choosing to go with this almost ethereal approach is a nice touch.
It's done. I'll be Queen of Firsthold, although I'm sure the engagement will be quite lengthy.
Concluding his mission as a mailman, Rouge discovers that through a cunning plan, his king has been able to procure the letter and is holding it at his capital in Orsinium. He is also directed to speak to Sindasa in hopes of finding out how this happened. This more direct approach to the dialogue is admirable, although it does remove some of the discovery and investigation. Originally, Morgaya tells the player that we would need to get into Minas Sera's good graces, and that the best way to do so would be through someone of a lower station. This doesn't make it obvious who to talk to, so the player could find themselves doing other random noble quests that aren't progressing them. In Skygerfall, we get straight to the point. You could argue that there isn't any reason to speak to Minas Sera now though, as we already know that Llugwych has the letter. In the original, we wouldn't need to. Sure, Minas Sera gives us a letter to give to Llugwych that helps convince him to give us the letter, but we still have to go through his dungeon to get it anyway. This dialogue worked in Daggerfall as it allowed the player to choose whether to go straight to Orsinium or to learn more about the letter from Minas Sera. But with that choice of procession removed in Skygerfall, it doesn't really make sense for Gruge to care what the Dowager Queen has to say at all when he could just go get the letter now himself. This was the only time that removing the choice of how to proceed hurt the role playing, so for the most part the more linear story works well. Essentially, this Minas Sera part should have been an optional side quest and not the necessary prelude to get in the letter. After finishing our conversation with Morgaya, Gruge receives a letter from Prince Loton of Sentinel. He is asking for help in return for information on Lysandus' lover. While Orica Zero said he removed all choice in his mod description, this isn't entirely true. We do amass 4 simultaneous quests that can be run in any order. They all have the same outcome of course, but at least you can choose which you would like to do first.
And who are you then? Yeah, I'm Sindessa. What's it to you?
Sindassa's quest plays out the same as in Daggerfall, but the random dungeon has been replaced with a handcrafted concoction from Orica Zero, utilising all of the dungeon blocks from Daggerfall. This dungeon is awesome, still pleasant to explore and not nearly as confusing as the originals, but includes everything you would expect to find in a Daggerfall dungeon. It was here where I wondered if it would have actually been better if every dungeon was remade with this philosophy in mind. Yeah, that would mean that all the old UESP guides would be useless, but it would help in making a lot of the old paths not just be awkwardly cut off. That would be a lot more work, so it is understandable that they used the method that they did. This will be our only chance to catch lycanthropy. If you don't cure it, you will become a wereball yourself. And just as it was in Daggerfall, it is crazily overpowered. If you want to make the game a whole lot easier, this is the choice for you. Now that Gruge knows what happened to the letter, it's time to confront Minas Sera, where we have to find the Knight of the Dragon that delivered it. There isn't much to say with these quests, they play out just as they did in Daggerfall, only without having to ask random NPCs for help, of which there aren't any anyway. Not that having NPCs matters, as they would just be window dressing and aren't necessary for this mod's goal. Minas Sera thanks us for sorting out this conundrum with the letter and directs Gruge to visit his liege to try and reclaim the letter. She hands us a letter that should help convince Llugwych, which seems pretty insulting to assume Llugwych wouldn't trust one of his own. Before we go do that though, Gruge decides that it is time to pay Prince Loton a visit and enter Sentinel. I love this desert setting so much. After hours of playing in the bleak wasteland that is the majority of Skyrim province, seeing this in the same engine is a treat. There are even rideable camels if you want to play this game without fast travel. For some reason, I don't recommend it for immersion reasons myself. The sun beats down hard on the city of Sentinel. Gruge can't help but wonder why the Divines decided to turn the blue meter to 11 here. Partially blind and fully aware that the desert architecture does look eerily similar to dwarven architecture, Gruge stumbles into the mightily impressive Dome Palace. Loton tells us of his conundrum regarding his brother, and we set off on another quest to solve a noble's problem. As random NPCs don't exist in this realm, we instead are directed to the local tavern, where we are then sent to the Underking's agent chilling in the temple next door. I liked this unique interaction with the mute elderly lady. It helps to show the Underking in this mysterious light that he needs for a character we never get to interact with.
It has come to our attention that the Underking is being wrongly accused of abducting Prince Arthaga.
The agent points us to a fortified island to the north, where we can learn the reason for the brother's missing nature. From this dungeon forward, far more of the non-necessary paths have been included. I'm not sure why it was at this point that this choice was made, but there is a noticeable jump in the difficulty of navigating these dungeons. Not to the point of needing a guide, they are still chopped down enough that you will eventually reach your goal, but they have gone from 5 to 10 minute sprints to a 25-minute dungeon crawl, much closer to the original. This is also where I soon discovered that the maps in Skyrim are useless for multi-tiered layouts. I may have had my issues with Daggerfall's 3D map, but at least it helped you navigate. This is worse than useless. It actively harms your ability to not get lost. At least if you stick to using your intuition and the quest marker for some general directions, you'll be able to find the quest objective eventually, and that is an upgrade over Daggerfall. By this point, Gruge has leveled his alteration a lot with the mark and recall spells, which are a must-have. They will make your experience a whole lot easier. Just dump your anchor somewhere in the overworld and you can fast travel wherever you need once you're done in the dungeon. Gruge returns to Sentinel only to be attacked by a zombie, a minion sent by Manny Marco. Prince Lotan is saddened but grateful for our discovery. In return, we are now privy to Lysandus' scandalous affair with Medora of the Direnni Tower. Lotan also tells us that we should speak to his mother regarding a job she has for us. We now have 4 quests we can choose from. Being an orc, it is only fair that we give our ancestral homeland a visit. Orsinium is the settlement that has been changed the most. In Daggerfall, it is your typical Wayrestian style town, but at the centre is a large structure constructed of sheets of metal. The orcs are massively flexing their mastery of smithing here. In Skygerfall, this has been updated to reflect the orc stronghold from Skyrim, with the palace being a reskinned chief's hut, now made of what looks like corrugated steel sheets. Other than the questionable use of corrugated steel, I like this change. It fits closer to the orc architecture that Tess has developed in the lore since Daggerfall was released, and is more fitting with the modern games. Gothwych, oddly enough, does not recognise Gruge as an orc, almost as if the original writer never intended for this interaction to be possible. Gruge shrugs this off as his lead challenging him to face off against the Stronghold's best orcs in a quest for the letter. This dungeon was the one I spent the most time in, a whopping 30 minutes. This is also the one where I felt properly lost, but through sheer force of will and a refusal to use a guide, I did eventually find the letter. Minnesera is pleased to get the letter that was rightfully hers and tells us that the totem mentioned within will soon be within our hands. Now to finally free Medora. This was the section I was afraid of the most, and I'm sure you all know why. In Daggerfall, you will have to trek through this hellhole at least 3 times. Even if you set your recall anchor next to Medora, you will still have to manually exit this dungeon every time. But the time has come. Gruge must finally face the dreaded Direnni Tower. Oddly enough, it was chosen to keep the exterior closer to the original tower, perhaps only because a white gold tower model wasn't available to mod in yet. It is a bit odd to update Orsinium with the new architecture that we know the orcs use, but then keep Direnni Tower looking like this, when new lore has already established that it was the original blueprint that Cyrodiil's white gold tower imitated. Gruge is really starting to come into his own with the combat. With the lack of obvious level scaling, enemies that would have been a terrifying presence in the original are nothing more than fodder for his enchanted war axe and brute strength. From around this point onwards, maybe 4 hours into my playthrough, the game became painfully easy on normal difficulty. It's fantastic to feel this kind of leveling in Skyrim, where often the enemies become stronger alongside you. I will say that maybe it was made a bit too easy though. Later on, as I passed level 15, I chose to increase the difficulty because I was even taking on vampire agents in just a few hits, and they were barely tickling me. This system has its pros and cons. Personally, I'm a fan of it. The tower is split into 2 sections. The first dungeon to do this so far. Finding Medora wasn't too hard, but the final encounter against the Lich was a little disappointing as he didn't cast any spells. This is an issue I noticed with a few of the enemies. The ones that would unleash devastating attacks via magic in Daggerfall either relied a lot on melee while casting a epoxy shield spell, or they were bugged entirely and didn't do anything. I'm not sure if this was my fault or the mod's. I installed it following the instructions provided, so I'm leading towards it being a problem with the mod. Having reached Medora, she gives Gruge one of the best new items in the game, teleports to Medora Direnni's scrolls. My prayers have been answered. Finally, we don't have to run through this place every damn time. We can simply warp in and out as we wish. If there is one thing that should be made mandatory in Daggerfall, it is this. To free Medora, we must find a unicorn horn inch dungeon. I had originally written a whole section about how this dungeon was broken, and after half an hour of wandering aimlessly with this useless map, I was forced to use TCL to find the objective. I even have footage showing how this section was entirely removed from the rest of the dungeon. After fact checking myself in Daggerfall though, turns out I just missed this torch. A little embarrassing. This was the only part of the playthrough in which I needed a guide. While we're here floating in the abyss, this is a great time to show just how much of the dungeons were left on the cutting room floor. It really is only the essential parts left. In this case, I estimate that only 20% of the dungeons survived. Still, I think this far more linear style suits Skygerfall very well, and except for this one occasion where I missed this torch puzzle, the dungeons have all been simple and fun. With Medora freed from her curse, it's time to give Manny Marco another visit.
I want you to bring me back the ghost of Prince Carolus.
He sends Grooge to Sentinel Castle to trap the soul of an ancient lich. I was excited to see what changes were done to this dungeon. For those who know, Sentinel Castle Dungeon has a pretty infamous puzzle involving magical barriers activated by levers that are placed all over the damn place. And I'm happy to report that it was replicated entirely here, for better or for worse. While Grooge didn't need a guide for this section, most probably would. All the castle dungeons in the original were notorious for being convoluted, and it is cool to see that Orikazero didn't change them, except for Wayrest Castle, where he self-admittedly made the teleport brick wall sections a bit more linear so that those who weren't using Mark and Recall could exit a bit easier. If you aren't using Mark and Recall by this point though, you are a masochist to be honest. As with Direnni Tower, the Lich doesn't put up much of a fight and Grooge is easily able to trap his soul. Grooge rummages through yet another reward chest and there it is. The cure to my complaint from earlier about the movement speed. Using the feat of Notorgo, Grooge's running speed feels almost 1-to-1 with Daggerfall when your character has about 50 to 60 points in the speed stat. I cannot write enough about how this made the dungeon crawling just so much better. Now that Grooge was a speedy boy, we could turn in the Lich's soul to Manny Marco where he boldly lies about the Underking's intentions. It's time to give Queen Akarifi a visit. The Red Guard leader asks Grooge to steal a painting from Wayrest Dungeon. As I mentioned, this dungeon was the only one Orikazero explicitly changed from the UESP's official guided path. As such, while still vast, getting to the painting directions wise was no issue just by relying on intuitive exploration. The arguments over whether Elder Scrolls combat has dumbed down will last for eons, but I will say that for this brief playthrough, I enjoyed my spell sword battles using Grooge. Fighting was pretty simple, mostly sticking to blocking and swinging, but I can see why some would prefer this over a more stat-based tabletop RPG style that Daggerfall has. Which is for sure one reason why someone may prefer to play Skygerfall instead. The painting this time around looks mightily similar to an Elder Scroll, which at least helps explain the magical properties of the painting I complained about in my analysis. Akarifi praised Grooge despite his bold-faced lie, and yet another letter is snuck onto our person, this time by the Underking once again. His agent is posted in the same location as last time and he directs us to find a cursed dagger in Castle Llugwych.
Infiltrate Castle Llugwych in Icaron and remove it.
I'll accept it. This was the dungeon I was mentioning earlier when I talked about how the interior design of the dungeon seems to get better over time. The hallways here feel more real, for lack of a better word. They feel more like Skyrim and less like a 90s dungeon crawler awkwardly ported forward 20 years, which of course it is. It's a shame really. If Privateer's hold looked this good, maybe a few more people wouldn't have given up over how ugly the dungeons look. The cursed dagger we were sent to find is a lovely 3D model of the box art D. After returning the dagger to the agent, he removes the curse and lets us keep it, a memento of our travels in the Llugwych Bay that we can display proudly in our house. Now that all those royal quests are concluded, we are finally in the end game, with just a few more linear quests until the end. Medora kicks us off by telepathically visiting Grooge once we conclude our business with the Underking. we need to recover the Dust of Restful Death, so that we can exorcise King Lysandus from this world. It's back to Grudge's favourite royal to ask where he has left it. King Gothway directs us to a dungeon to the north of the Isle of Balfiera. This is another handcrafted dungeon by Orikazero, and once again he's knocked it out of the park. Honestly, if he had chosen to recreate every dungeon in the game with a mix of Skyrim and Daggerfall dungeon styles and design philosophies, this mod may arguably be even better, even with it being a complete departure from the game it is recreating. While I love Daggerfall, the dungeons are a product of their time, and this more linear style certainly has its place. With the dust in hand, we can swiftly teleport back to Medora to begin our quest to free her lover from the haunted form he is forced to possess. Lysandus' tomb has been nicely recreated. The right hand side has been removed, and rightly so, as it could lead the player to being lost for hours for a mistake they made in the first 30 seconds of the dungeon. The large chambers here and higher level enemies felt great with Skyrim's gameplay. The amount of vampire ancients Grudge is annihilating now really helps with that feeling of progression. As with the intro, the cutscene of old is replaced with an in-game character using the same voice actor as the Emperor.
You soothed my rage. I do not seek to be placated.
My critique from earlier remains. It would have been nice for the voice actor to try and emulate the powerful projection that Lysandus had. In Daggerfall, he sounded closer to your stereotypical ghost with a clear disdain for those who wronged him. Whereas while this Skygerfall Lysandus does sound regal, it doesn't have the needed aggression, being very subdued instead. With Woodborne's treachery revealed, it's time to bring him down. Unlike in Daggerfall, you won't be able to bring down Woodborne peacefully by stealing his diary and taking it to any of the interested parties in the bay. Killing him yourself is the only option. A decision Orikazero made clear, which makes it even odder that upon defeating the evil lord, we can find his diary on his person and then continue that part of the quest, including the original dialogue where the person you give the diary to details how they will take down Woodborne themselves. I have no idea why this is included after being forced to kill Woodborne. It doesn't really make any sense. I was okay with the option being removed entirely, but for the letter to still be included anyway is pretty weird. Grudge gave the diary to Nulfarga as she seemed to be the one who would care about its contents the most. With the Lysandus plotline concluded, the Arrow of All-Knowing directs us to check out our player home in Daggerfall for any letters. Lo and behold, the arrow was right and Grudge finds a letter directing him back to the Isle of Bethany. Lady Brisienna applauds us for solving the mystery of King Lysandus and directs us to steal the Totem of Tiber Septim from the Castle Daggerfall dungeon. There's not much to say at this point. The dungeon is well done, albeit smaller. I do really like this take on the totem though, a bit more literal, with Tiber Septim's head being visible while still keeping its baby in a bundle shape. The totem actually speaks when picked up too, rather than just a pop-up. A pleasant surprise, even if it did remind me of Meridia's beacon.
A new hand touches the beacon.
With the totem in hand, Grudge returned to his home only to find the Knights of the Dragon waiting for him. They are attempting to steal back the totem for their liege. Nothing a few bashes to the head with some orcish strength can't solve. The note makes it clear that if we had chosen to give up the totem, it would have been considered choosing to give the totem to Gothred, and the final choice would have been locked in. This encounter is a commendable attempt to keep the player accountable for actually breaking into the castle. In Daggerfall, you can enter the castle and murder all of the guards at your leisure with no consequence, making this addition to Skygerfall actually help make the world feel a little bit more real than the original did, despite lacking any kind of life in the city. Entering our home and we can find all of the letters that are normally dumped onto the player via a million pop-ups. Clearly Orikazero noticed that this was quite annoying and also hilarious with how aloof the playable character seemingly was in Daggerfall. It is equally as funny that the powers of the Bay are just sending the mail to our house though, like it isn't important. I guess they might have at least paid to use first class. Alongside these requests, we also find the lore dump letters from the Mantella Revealed quest. I was originally wondering if these may be cut, the same way Elisana's quest seemed to have been, so this was a good surprise, especially as these letters are pretty important in giving the player the necessary knowledge behind the Numidium and the Totem, which will help inform their intimate choice. While I stand by my statement that the most peaceful option is the Underking, Gruge does not care for undead men, and it's not like he could read any of those letters anyway, so it's off to King Gothwog the totem goes. With the Great Numidium behind them, there is no way the orcs will not be able to gain their independence.
I see that the totem has found its way into the hands of someone with royal blood.
Nulfarga contacts Gruge as a disembodied voice, and it's off to the final dungeon. When I first saw how cut down the dungeons were, I was really curious how the author would approach Aetherius, seeing as this is the craziest dungeon in the entirety of Daggerfall, and he didn't disappoint. This is one of the few dungeons that doesn't have any cuts, or at least any that I noticed. Everything is here. The asteroids, the pyramid, the upside down temple, the blind god, Sheogorath, now with his famous Scottish accent, and even the massive crossbow and sword. It is spectacular to see this in Skyrim. It doesn't go without some sacrifices though. The galaxy, for example, is only for show and can easily be levitated through. That is still preferable to a space textured box, to be honest. And at least you don't die every time you fall here. The side paths aren't as obvious as they were in Daggerfall, which may confuse people who aren't using a guide, but for the most part I was very happy to see Aetherius done so well. It should be noted that the difficulty is nowhere near as hard as it was in Daggerfall. Between Gruge being nearly level 20 with the best gear he can get, and the fact that some of the enemies cannot use the magic that they abused in the original game, sections that were once frustrating are now leisurely. The vampires, for example, are a breeze, and all those Daedra that would bombard you in the crossbow room simply stand in their cages throwing insults at you. Even by turning up the difficulty, the enemies weren't much of a challenge against Gruge's strength and ability to heal when needed. This isn't me ragging on Skyrim for allowing this, by the way. I abuse healing in combat all the time in every Elder Scrolls. If you're gonna let me use magic, I always will, unless I want to gimp myself for roleplaying. Gruge enjoys abusing magic, and he isn't going to change just because the Daedra of Aetherius refused to use their mana. Finally, we reach what all of this main quest was about, the Mantella. With it, we can release the Numidium for King Gothwog and begin his war of freedom. Bursting with pride, Gruge activates the green gem and is transported before Nulfarga, where she announces that our choice will be written within the Elder Scrolls. A pop-up tells us the result of our choice. While it's not as interesting as a cutscene, it's an understandable compromise. The game is finished and the screen fades to black. This may look like a joke, but nope, the whole time Skygerfall was just the most elaborate prequel to Skyrim possible. After we read the Elder Scroll, Nulfarga tells us that if we choose to, she can use the ongoing warp in the west to transport us to a time in the future. She will even be kind enough to send our belongings with us as long as we leave them in a chest in our home. Eager to see if Gothwog was successful, Gruge accepts, dumping all that we have into the chest and reading the Elder Scroll to travel us forward through time. This was a great choice. Not only does it let you continue to play a character you may have grown quite fond of over the 8 hours of this mod, but it lets you bring all of the unique items that it adds with you. In the future, after the release of Skywind and Skyblivion, we may even be able to go through the titles one by one. Now that would be one hell of an adventure. Skyrim itself plays normally, except that Gruge is obviously super overpowered for this tutorial. He could have probably taken on Alduin right there in his prisoner's clothes. There were some leaks through time, so to say, with a few Daggerfall enemies making their way to the present time, but I saw this more of a neat side effect of Nulfarga tampering with the warp in the west. I have no idea if this was intentional though. Go into Jorvaska in Whiterun and Gruge can reunite with his gear. And all of our spells are here too, meaning we can sprint across the countryside at breakneck speed, recall to an anchor when we please, and most importantly, against Todd's will, we can levitate high up in the air. Hey, even climbing works now. Well, kind of. Was Skygerfall a decent enough replacement for those who cannot play Daggerfall then? No, because the main quest is maybe 10% of what Daggerfall has to offer. Now for playing the main quest, not only is it a good replacement, it is actually better and more coherent for the most part. My gripes with the main quest were obvious in my analysis, and while that attempt at a non-linear story is applauded, I don't believe it added to the questline a whole lot. So as it is right now, ignoring any mods for DFU that may help this also, Skygerfall is the superior way to play the main quest in my opinion. The dungeons are less frustrating and the storytelling is so much easier to understand. You don't even need a notebook to make sense of it. Oricus Zero has done an excellent job with this. Some areas could do with a lick of polish. The visual bugs are obvious and the dungeon designs go from decent to ugly. However, he was able to achieve his goal of successfully telling the story of Daggerfall within Skyrim, and I applaud him for that. Of course, if you prefer Daggerfall's gameplay, this video isn't for you, but if you've tried Daggerfall and found that even with mods it just wasn't for you, give Skygerfall a chance instead. It may be the perfect way for you to experience this classic fantasy fable yourself. Thanks for watching. This was way longer than I intended, but this mod deserved it. Comment below your thoughts on Skygerfall. Have you tried it? If so, what was your takeaway? My next project is going to be Arena. It's time to see how the Elder Scrolls Chapter 1 stands up against the test of time. As always, I'll see you in the next one.
Halt. Halt.
Look how they massacred my boy.